Sometimes the greatest strength lies in choosing to be gentle when you could destroy everything around you. There's something deeply moving about a man who walks away from power to find peace, only to have that peace threatened by those who mistake kindness for weakness. On the Texas borderlands, Elias tends his farm in quiet simplicity. He's been Amish for 20 years, helping neighbors and living by old ways. When armed men in black SUVs roll up demanding everything he owns, they see just another easy target. But Elias was once Ghost Shepherd, a military operator who left violence behind to find God. Now, these men threaten the innocent families he protects. What happens when a man who chose peace must decide whether to break his vows to save others? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Texas sky in shades of amber and rose, as Elias Zimmerman walked the perimeter of his 40-acre farm. His weathered boots left deep impressions in the dew-soaked earth, each step deliberate and measured. At 62, his beard had turned silver white, and his hands bore the honest calluses of 2 decades spent working this land. To anyone watching, he was the picture of Amish simplicity: black trousers, white shirt, suspenders, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded eyes the color of winter steel. But those eyes held secrets that would have unsettled his peaceful neighbors. 20 years ago, on a humid night in Afghanistan, a man known only as Ghost Shepherd had made a decision that would change everything. After witnessing his entire unit die in an ambush he should have prevented, Master Sergeant Elias Reeves had walked into his commanding officer's tent and requested immediate discharge. The nightmares had become unbearable. The weight of 43 confirmed kills pressed down on his chest every time he tried to sleep. The faces of the men he couldn't save haunted every quiet moment. The army psychiatrist had recommended extended leave. His handler in special operations had offered a promotion, but Elias knew something they didn't. He was losing pieces of his soul with every mission, and if he didn't stop, there would be nothing left worth saving. He'd driven his pickup truck across half the country, sleeping in rest stops and cheap motels, until he found himself in this corner of Texas, where the border stretched endlessly toward Mexico. The land was harsh but honest, and when he'd met Samuel Baylor, an Amish elder, whose own son had died in Iraq, something had clicked into place. "You look like a man carrying too much weight," Samuel had said, studying Elias with kind but knowing eyes. "More than I can bear much longer," Elias had admitted. "Then set it down, son. Set it down and learn a different way to live." The conversion hadn't been easy. Learning Pennsylvania Dutch at 42, adapting to life without electricity or modern conveniences, submitting to the authority of church elders, it had all felt impossible at first. But gradually, the rhythm of seasons and the gentle discipline of plain living had begun to heal wounds that military medicine couldn't touch. His farmhouse was modest but well-maintained, with a deep front porch where he often sat in the evenings, whittling or reading from his well-worn Bible. Inside, the rooms were sparsely furnished but comfortable, lit by oil lamps and heated by a wood-burning stove. The walls held no photographs, the Amish way, but if someone looked carefully at the mason jar buried beneath the porch steps, they might find dog tags that read Reeves, Elias M., and a serial number that would raise flags in certain government databases. His neighbors knew him as a man of few words but generous actions. When the Stoltzfus family's barn burned down, Elias had worked 18-hour days helping rebuild it. When old Martha Yoder fell ill, he tended her livestock without being asked. Children from the settlement would often find small wooden toys, carved horses, birds, crosses, left anonymously on their doorsteps, and though no one could prove it, everyone suspected Elias's handiwork. The nearest town was Esperanza, 15 miles of dusty road that connected their small Amish settlement to the outside world. Sheriff Maria Santos had grown to respect the quiet farmer who occasionally came to town for supplies. She noticed things others missed, how his eyes automatically scanned for exits when he entered a building, how he positioned himself to watch the door, how his seemingly casual posture could shift to combat ready in a heartbeat. She'd run his name through the system once, out of professional curiosity, and found only a clean record and an address that had been active for exactly 20 years. "You're not from around here originally," she'd mentioned once while he was buying fence wire at Morrison's Hardware. "No, ma'am," he'd replied politely, "but I am now." Something in his tone had told her not to push further. The settlement itself was home to 17 families, each trying to live by principles of simplicity, community, and peace. They raised crops, kept livestock, built furniture, and quilted. They helped each other through hardships and celebrated together during good times. It was a life that moved with the sun and seasons rather than clocks and deadlines. But even in this peaceful corner of Texas, the outside world had begun to intrude. The Mexican border was only 30 miles south, and in recent months there had been troubling signs. Helicopters flying low at night, trucks with no license plates speeding along back roads, young men in expensive cars who didn't belong in farming country. Sheriff Santos had briefed the community elders about increased cartel activity in the region. Drug runners were using remote ranch roads to move product north, and some cartels were expanding into human trafficking, gun running, and extortion. So far, the Amish settlement had been left alone, perhaps too isolated and poor to interest the criminals. But Elias had noticed things that worried him. Tire tracks on his property that weren't from his neighbors' buggies, fresh cigarette butts. Along his fence line, the feeling of being watched during his morning walks. He'd mentioned none of this to anyone. Instead, he'd taken to varying his routines slightly, checking his property lines more carefully, paying attention to which birds went silent and when. Old habits died hard, even buried beneath 20 years of peaceful living. His daily routine began before dawn with prayer and scripture reading. Then came the feeding of his 6 dairy cows, 2 dozen chickens, and the pair of draft horses, Ben and Jerry, that he'd trained to pull his plow and wagon. After breakfast, he worked his fields, corn, wheat, and vegetables that fed his family and provided surplus for the community. Lunch was simple fare eaten in the shade of his porch. Afternoons brought maintenance work, repairing equipment, mending fences, caring for his small orchard. Evenings were for community. He might visit the Baylor family, whose youngest daughter had shown him how to braid corn husks for dolls. Or he'd join the men at Samuel's workshop, where they built furniture and discussed matters of faith and farming. Sometimes he'd simply sit on his porch, carving small figures from cedar wood and watching the sun set over land that had taught him what peace could look like. In his bedroom dresser drawer, wrapped in soft cloth, lay a hand-carved wooden cross, the first thing he'd made after converting to the Amish faith. It was simple work, rough around the edges, but it represented something profound, his commitment to leaving violence behind and choosing a different path. He'd carved it during his darkest period, when the nightmares were worst, and he wasn't. Sure, he could keep his vow of non-violence. Touching it reminded him why he'd come here and what he'd promised to become. The community had accepted him gradually, as was their way. They'd been patient with his struggles to learn their customs, forgiving of his occasional slips into military bearing, understanding when memories made him withdraw for days at a time. Samuel Byler, in particular, had become both mentor and father figure, guiding Elias through the spiritual disciplines that had slowly restored his sense of purpose. "A man doesn't just put off his old self like changing clothes," Samuel had told him during one of their long conversations. "It takes time to grow into who God means for you to be." But as Elias finished his morning inspection of the farm, noticing fresh tire tracks along his southern fence line, he wondered if time was a luxury he might not have much longer. The tracks were from heavy vehicles, multiple trucks moving at night. The pattern suggested reconnaissance rather than casual trespassing. He knelt beside the clearest print, his trained eye automatically cataloguing details: tire width, tread, pattern, vehicle weight distribution. The truck had stopped here for several minutes, long enough for someone to study his property, perhaps take photographs. There were boot prints nearby, and the faint smell of cigarettes still lingered in the morning air. Standing slowly, Elias removed his hat and ran his fingers through graying hair. For 20 years, he'd been Elias Zimmerman, peaceful farmer and faithful community member, but the man who'd once been Ghost Shepherd recognized the signs of an operation in its planning stages. Someone was taking an interest in his farm, his neighbors, his chosen family. He walked back toward his house, moving with the same unhurried pace he'd maintained for 2 decades. But inside his chest, something that had been sleeping for 20 years began to stir. The war might be coming, whether he wanted it or not, and if it came to his door, if it threatened the people he'd sworn to protect through a peaceful example, what then? The wooden cross in his dresser drawer had been carved by hands that had learned to create instead of destroy. But those same hands remembered other skills, muscle memory that 2 decades of farming couldn't completely erase. He prayed he'd never have to choose between the man he'd been and the man he'd become. As he reached his porch steps, directly above the buried mason jar that held his past, Elias Zimmerman whispered a prayer for continued peace. But somewhere, in the deeper chambers of his heart, Ghost Shepherd was already calculating angles, escape routes, and fields of fire. The black SUVs came on a Tuesday morning, just as Elias was finishing his milking. 3 vehicles, their engines rumbling like distant thunder as they wound up the dirt road toward his property. He set down the milk pail carefully and walked to his porch, wiping his hands on a clean rag. The lead vehicle stopped 20 feet from his front steps. The other 2 positioned themselves to block any retreat, a tactical formation that told Elias everything he needed to know about his visitor's intentions and training level. 6 men emerged from the vehicles, all carrying weapons with the casual arrogance of those accustomed to intimidating farmers and shopkeepers. Their leader was a lean man with neck tattoos and gold teeth, wearing expensive boots that had never seen honest work. He approached the porch with a swagger that suggested this was routine business. "Buenos dias, old man," he called out in accented English. "I am Carlos Mendoza. We need to have a conversation about your situation here." Elias remained on his porch, hands clasped behind his back in what appeared to be a peaceful gesture. In reality, it was a combat stance that would allow him to reach the knife hidden behind his suspenders, old habits that he'd never quite managed to abandon. "Good morning," Elias replied calmly. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" Carlos laughed, a sound without warmth. "Oh, you're going to help us, grandfather. You see, this area, your farm, your neighbors' farms, it's become very useful to our organization. We move product through here, and we need places to store things, safe places." "I'm afraid you have the wrong property," Elias said, his voice steady. "This is a peaceful farming community. We don't involve ourselves in outside business." "That's where you're wrong, viejo." Carlos stepped closer, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Your involvement is not optional. We know you Amish keep cash. We know you have storage buildings. We know you don't call the police when you have problems." The other men had spread out in a loose semicircle, weapons visible but not directly threatening. Yet, Elias recognized the formation. Standard intimidation tactics designed to make targets feel surrounded and helpless. "We have very little money," Elias said truthfully, "and what we have goes to support our families and community." Carlos pulled out a photograph, an aerial view of the Amish settlement. Red circles marked each farm, including detailed notes about buildings, livestock, and estimated population. "We've been watching, old man, planning. Your community is perfect for our needs. Isolated, quiet, no modern security systems, and best of all, you people are pacifists. You won't fight back." A chill ran down Elias's spine, but not from fear. It was recognition, the cold calculation of a predator who had studied his prey and found them vulnerable. But Carlos had made a fundamental error in his assessment. "What exactly are you asking of us?" Elias kept his voice level, even as every combat instinct screamed warnings. "Simple. You provide storage space when we need it. You keep your mouths shut when strangers come and go. You give us whatever cash you have on hand when we ask for it. In return, we let you and your families live in peace. And if we refuse," Carlos's smile turned ugly. "Let me show you what happens to people who refuse." He gestured to one of his men, who produced a tablet computer. The screen showed security footage of a Mexican village. Burning buildings, bodies in the street, women and children fleeing in terror. "San Miguel de los Santos," Carlos said with obvious pride. "Population was about the same as your little settlement here. They thought they were too poor and too pious for us to bother with them. They were wrong." Elias studied the images with the detached analysis of a soldier, cataloguing weapons, tactics, and casualties. But beneath that analytical layer, something deeper was stirring, a fury that he'd spent 20 years learning to control. "These were innocent people," he said quietly. "Innocent is a luxury for those who cooperate," Carlos replied. "Your choice is simple: work with us or join them." Movement caught Elias's peripheral vision. Through his field glasses, habits died. Hard. He could see into the neighboring property where the Stoltzfus family lived. 8-year-old Rebecca was hanging laundry with her mother, while her baby brother played in the dirt nearby. The sight of those children, innocent and unaware of the evil that had come to their valley, made something shift inside Elias's chest. "I need time to discuss this with our elders," he said, though every fiber of his being wanted to end this threat immediately. "Time?" Carlos laughed harshly. "Time is what you don't have, grandfather. We need an answer now. And to help you decide," he nodded to 2 of his men, who immediately began walking toward the Stoltzfus farm. "Where are they going?" Elias's voice carried a new edge that made Carlos look at him more sharply. "Insurance," Carlos said. "Sometimes people think more clearly when their neighbors are providing motivation." Elias watched the 2 gunmen approach the innocent family, and something that had been carefully buried for 20 years began clawing its way to the surface. The photograph in his wallet, blood-stained and creased from years of carrying, showed 8 men in desert camouflage. 7 of them had died because he'd hesitated, because he'd tried to handle a tactical situation with diplomatic thinking. He would not make that mistake again. "Call your men back," Elias said quietly. "Excuse me, call them back. Now." Carlos studied the Amish farmer more carefully, noting something in his posture that hadn't been there moments before. The old man's shoulders had squared slightly. His weight shifted forward onto the balls of his feet. "I don't think you understand your position here, grandfather. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and—" The scream that cut through the morning air came from the Stoltzfus farm. Rebecca's voice, high and terrified, calling for her mother. Elias closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for a prayer and a promise to faces that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades. When he opened them again, Carlos took an involuntary step backward. The mild-mannered farmer was gone, replaced by something predatory and infinitely dangerous. "Mister," Elias said, his voice carrying 20 years of suppressed violence, "you just made the biggest mistake of your very short life." "What did you just say to me?" But Elias was no longer listening. He was calculating. 6 targets, multiple weapons, civilians in the line of fire, approximately 90 seconds before the situation at the neighboring farm became irreversible. The tactical part of his mind, the part he'd tried so hard to bury, began issuing orders with mechanical precision. Carlos reached for his weapon, but found himself looking down the barrel of a combat knife that had appeared in the Amish farmer's hand with impossible speed. "Tell your men to walk away from that family," Elias said. And now his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "Tell them now, or I will show you what 20 years of trying to forget how to kill people looks like when the safety comes off." For the first time since arriving, Carlos felt a chill of genuine uncertainty. This was not the reaction they had prepared for. Another scream from the neighboring farm made Elias's decision for him. The wooden cross he'd carved during his darkest nights was a symbol of transformation and peace. But sometimes peace had to be fought for, and sometimes love demanded violence to protect the innocent. Ghost Shepherd had work to do. The standoff lasted exactly 7 heartbeats before Carlos made his choice. Faced with a blade at his throat and steel in the old farmer's eyes, he barked orders in rapid Spanish to his men at the neighboring farm. They reluctantly returned, confusion evident in their movements. Elias stepped back, but kept the knife visible. His entire demeanor transformed from peaceful farmer to something far more dangerous. The change was so complete that Carlos found himself reassessing everything about the situation. "You have 5 minutes to get off my land," Elias said quietly. "Take your business elsewhere." Carlos attempted to reassert control. "You think one old man with a kitchen knife can—" "Oh, that's not a kitchen knife," one of his subordinates said nervously, recognizing the military-grade tactical blade. "And look at how he holds it." Indeed, Elias's grip and stance were textbook special forces, knife held low and back, body positioned for maximum leverage and speed. Carlos might not have military training, but his man Rodriguez had done 2 tours before turning to cartel work, and he knew what he was seeing. "This changes nothing," Carlos said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "You cannot protect everyone. We know where your neighbors live, where their children play. Fight us, and we'll kill them all." The words were meant to intimidate, but they had the opposite effect. Elias's grip shifted slightly on the knife handle, and Carlos caught a glimpse of something in those winter steel eyes that made his blood run cold. "Rodriguez," Elias said without looking away from Carlos, his voice carrying an odd note of recognition. "2nd Battalion, 10th Mountain Division. You were in Kandahar in 2001. Rodriguez's eyes widened. "How could you possibly—" "Because I was there too. Different unit, same sector. You lost a lot of good men that winter." The confirmation that this mild Amish farmer had military experience sent a ripple of unease through the cartel group. Rodriguez stepped forward slightly, studying. Elias, with new attention. "What was your unit?" Rodriguez asked. "That's classified," Elias replied. "But you know what ghost teams do." The blood drained from Rodriguez's face. Ghost teams were special operations units that officially didn't exist. The men who did the jobs that never made it into any reports. If this farmer had been ghost ops, they were facing someone far more dangerous than they'd bargained for. Carlos, growing frustrated with the sudden shift in dynamics, pulled his sidearm. "Enough games, old man. Military or not, you're outnumbered, and—" Rodriguez grabbed his boss's wrist before he could raise the weapon. "Carlos, no, we need to think about this." "Think about what?" "He's one man." "He's a ghost operator," Rodriguez hissed. "These are the guys who took down entire terrorist cells with nothing but field improvisation. If he's been living here quietly for 20 years, there's a reason, and we just gave him a reason to stop being quiet." While the cartel members argued among themselves, Elias allowed his gaze to sweep across his property with new eyes. 20 years of peaceful farming had given him intimate knowledge of every tree, every rise and depression in the land, every structure. Now, his tactical mind began cataloging these features not as farm elements, but as defensive positions, fields of fire, and strategic advantages. His barn offered elevated shooting positions and thick stone walls. The old well could provide cover and concealment. The drainage ditches he dug for irrigation would make excellent approach routes. His workshop contained tools that could be quickly converted to weapons. Most importantly, he knew this terrain in a way that no outside force could match. "You have 2 minutes left," Elias said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "Use them wisely." Carlos holstered his weapon, recognizing that the situation had spiraled beyond his control. but his pride demanded some face-saving gesture. "This isn't over, grandfather. We'll be back, and next time we'll come prepared for your little war games." "Next time," Elias replied with quiet certainty, "you won't make it off my land alive." The cartel members retreated to their vehicles, but Carlos couldn't resist one final threat. 24 hours, old man. Give us what we want, or we'll burn this whole valley down around you." The SUVs roared to life and sped away, kicking up clouds of dust that took several minutes to settle. Only when they were completely gone did Elias allow his combat posture to relax slightly. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline surge that came from accessing skills he'd tried so hard to bury. The knife felt natural in his grip, as comfortable as a favorite tool. His mind was already running scenarios, calculating odds, planning defensive strategies. He walked slowly to his house and sat heavily in his porch rocker, still gripping the tactical blade. Inside his bedroom, in the top drawer of his dresser, lay his well-worn Bible. The margins were filled with his handwritten notes, verses about forgiveness and turning the other cheek, passages about peace and loving one's enemies. He'd spent countless hours studying those words, trying to reshape his soul around principles of nonviolence. But now, faced with a threat to innocent families, those peaceful teachings felt impossibly distant. How do you love enemies who torture? Children? How do you turn the other cheek to men who burn villages for profit? His breathing gradually returned to normal, but his mind remained in tactical mode. Carlos and his crew would be back, probably with reinforcements. They'd studied the settlement enough to know about the Amish commitment to pacifism, and they'd expect no organized resistance. What they wouldn't expect was a former special operations soldier who knew this terrain intimately. The sound of footsteps made him look up. Samuel Byler was walking up the path, his weathered face creased with worry. "Elias," the elder called out, "are you all right? We saw the vehicles leaving." For a moment, Elias considered lying, maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed. But the tactical knife still in his hand made deception impossible. "No, Samuel," he said quietly, "I'm not all right, and neither is our community." The old Amish man approached slowly, his eyes taking in Elias's altered posture, the military-grade blade, the subtle but unmistakable shift from farmer to soldier. Who were those men? Cartel. They want to use our settlement as a base of operations. They've threatened our families. Samuel studied his friend's face, seeing something there that he'd suspected but never confirmed during their 20 years of friendship. And the knife? Elias looked down at the weapon, as if seeing it for the first time. "Something I hoped I'd never need again. There are always choices, my friend. Violence is never the only path." "I know. I've lived by that principle for 20 years. Elias met Samuel's eyes with obvious pain. "But they've threatened children, Samuel. They've threatened Rebecca and little David. They showed me pictures of what they did to the last community that refused them." Samuel sat down heavily in the other porch chair, suddenly looking every one of his 74 years. "What do you need from us?" The question surprised Elias. He'd expected condemnation, excommunication, rejection from the community that had given him a new life. "You're not going to tell me that violence solves nothing?" "Violence solves nothing," Samuel said gently, "but sometimes it stops something worse from happening. I buried my son after he died in Iraq, fighting to protect innocent people. I understand the difference between aggression and protection." Elias felt something loosen in his chest, relief that he wouldn't have to choose between his adopted family and his protective instincts. "They'll be back tomorrow," he said, "with more men, more weapons. They think we're helpless, are we?" Elias looked out across the peaceful farmland where children played and families worked in safety, then down at the knife that felt so familiar in his scarred hands. "No," he said quietly, "we're not helpless at all." That evening, the community elders gathered in Samuel Byler's workshop. Word of the cartel visit had spread quickly through the settlement, and for the first time in their collective memory, The peaceful farmers found themselves discussing matters of defense and warfare. Elias sat quietly in the corner, still wearing his plain clothes, but somehow looking different to those who knew him best. The tactical knife lay on the workbench between them, an alien presence in a room normally filled with hand planes and wood shavings. "Tell us everything," Samuel said simply. Elias recounted the morning's events, leaving out nothing. The threats, the surveillance photos, the reference to the destroyed Mexican village. As he spoke, he watched the faces around him grow increasingly grave. Jacob Stoltzfus, whose daughter had been threatened, spoke first. "These men, they would hurt our children, without hesitation," Elias replied. "To them, we're not people. We're resources to be exploited or obstacles to be removed." Elder Daniel Yoder, approaching 80, and the settlement's unofficial patriarch, leaned forward on his cane. "And you believe they'll return tomorrow?" "I guarantee it," Carlos struck. "Me as a man who can't afford to lose face in front of his subordinates. He'll come back with overwhelming force to make an example of us." "How many men?" asked Benjamin Miller, whose farm bordered the main road. "Hard to say. Probably a dozen, maybe more. Enough to surround the settlement and hit multiple targets simultaneously." The room fell silent as the peaceful farmers contemplated the reality of armed violence coming to their valley. These were men who had never owned guns, never struck another person in anger, never conceived of their neighbors as anything other than fellow travelers on a spiritual journey. "There must be another way," said Elder Yoder finally. We'll contact the authorities. Sheriff Santos is a good woman, but she's got 2 deputies and maybe an hour response time if she's lucky," Elias interrupted. "By the time help arrives, it will be over. Then we evacuate," suggested Jacob. "Take the children and families somewhere safe until this passes." Elias shook his head. "Where? This isn't a localized problem. The cartels are expanding their territory, and if we run from this valley, we'll just find them waiting somewhere else. Besides, leaving would mean abandoning everything we've built here." Samuel had remained quiet during the discussion, but now he spoke with the authority of his years and position. "Elias, we need to know who you really are." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished lamp. Around the room, faces turned toward the man they'd known as a peaceful farmer for 2 decades. Elias reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a photograph, creased and stained, but still clear enough to make out 8 men in desert camouflage, all heavily armed and bearing the hard expressions of career soldiers, special operations. We called ourselves ghost teams because officially we didn't exist. Our job was to eliminate high-value targets and disrupt enemy operations in places where regular military couldn't operate. He passed the photograph around the room. Each elder studied it carefully, seeing a younger version of their neighbor, lean, dangerous, and utterly unlike the gentle farmer they knew. "I was team leader for 7 years, 43 confirmed eliminations, hundreds of missions across 3 theaters of operation. I was very good at my job." "What changed?" Samuel asked. Quietly, Elias pointed to the other men in the photograph. "Afghanistan. We were tasked with eliminating a Taliban commander who was coordinating attacks on civilian refugees. The intelligence was good, the plan was solid. But I hesitated at a crucial moment, tried to minimize casualties instead of following tactical protocol." His voice grew distant with memory. 7 of my men died because I chose compassion over combat effectiveness. The Taliban commander escaped and went on to orchestrate 3 more refugee camp attacks. Hundreds of innocent people died because I wasn't ruthless enough when it mattered. The room remained silent as the elders absorbed this revelation. Their gentle neighbor, the man who carved toys for their children and helped rebuild barns, was also a trained killer with blood on his hands. "That's when you came to us," Samuel said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I was broken, couldn't sleep, couldn't function, couldn't live with what I'd done and what I'd failed to do. I needed to find a different way to be human." Elder Yoder, spoke with surprising gentleness. "And did you find it?" Elias looked around the room at these men who had accepted him, taught him, and given him a chance to rebuild his soul. "For 20 years, yes, you gave me peace. You showed me how to create instead of destroy, how to nurture instead of eliminate. You saved my life in every way that matters. But now that peace is threatened," Jacob said. "Yes, and I'm the only one here who knows how to fight back." The moral weight of the situation settled over the room like morning fog. These men had built their lives around principles of non-violence, turning the other cheek, loving their enemies. But they were also fathers and grandfathers, protectors of families and community. Benjamin Miller cleared his throat nervously. "If you fought these men, would you win?" Elias considered the question with professional detachment. 6 men in the initial contact, probably 12 to 15 tomorrow. Unknown weapons and training levels, but generally cartel security is poorly. Disciplined compared to military standards. They'll have superior firepower but inferior tactics. On terrain I know intimately, with preparation time. Yes, I could win. At what cost? To them? Complete elimination. To us? Elias paused, calculating. If I do this, some of them will. Escape initially and report back. The cartel will send more men, better trained and equipped. It becomes a war. And wars don't end until one side can't continue fighting. The elders exchanged glances, each struggling with the same impossible choice between their deepest convictions and their duty to protect innocent lives. "Is there no middle ground?" asked Samuel. "Some way to discourage them without—" "No," Elias said firmly. "These aren't reasonable men who can be negotiated with. They're predators who only understand strength. Half measures will get people killed, probably starting with the children to make their point." Elder Yoda struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. At nearly 80, he had seen the world change in ways his younger self could never have imagined. 2 world wars, the Depression, the transformation of agriculture, the encroachment of modern violence on their peaceful community. "Brother Elias," he said formally, using the term that signified full acceptance within their fellowship. "If you choose to protect us, you will have our support. But understand, once you take up arms again, you cannot undo that choice. The man who fights tomorrow will not be the same man who has farmed here peacefully for 20 years. Elias nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. He would be crossing a line that had taken 2 decades to establish, abandoning a hard-won identity for one he'd thought was buried forever. In his barn, hidden in a wooden beam where it had waited, for 20 years, was a tactical knife that matched the one now on Samuel's workbench. He'd hidden it there during his first month on the farm, unable to completely let go of the tools of his former trade. Tomorrow he might need both blades. "I know," he said quietly, "but if I don't fight, Rebecca Stoltzfus won't live to see her 9th birthday. That's not a choice I can live with." Samuel reached across the workbench and placed his weathered hand over Elias's scarred one. "Then may God forgive us all for what must be done." Dawn came grey and overcast, with the oppressive weight of an approaching storm. Elias had been awake since 3 o'clock, moving through his property with the silent precision of his former profession. Every fence line, every building, every natural defensive position had been catalogued and prepared. In his bedroom dresser, beneath carefully folded plain clothes, lay a handwritten letter that he'd kept for 20 years. The envelope was addressed in a woman's careful script, and inside were 3 pages of gratitude from Maria Santos, not the sheriff, but the widow of Sergeant Miguel Santos, who had died in Elias's arms during that final, disastrous mission in Afghanistan. "Your husband saved my life twice," Elias had written to her after Miguel's funeral. "I should have saved his." Her response had arrived 6 months later, carried by a chaplain who'd tracked him down in his early days of Amish conversion. The letter spoke of forgiveness, of Miguel's belief in his mission, of how proud she was that her husband had served with men like Elias. She'd enclosed a photo of Miguel with their newborn daughter and asked Elias to remember her father as a hero, not a casualty of war. That letter had become his anchor during the darkest periods of adjustment to peaceful life. When the nightmares came, when the urge for violence threatened to overwhelm his newfound faith, he would read Maria's words and remember that redemption was possible even for men who had blood on their hands. But now, as he prepared to take up arms again, the letter felt like an accusation. Miguel had died because Elias chose compassion over tactical necessity. How many more would die if he made the same mistake again? The sound of approaching vehicles pulled him from his thoughts. 3 SUVs this time, moving slowly up the main road toward the settlement. Elias watched from his kitchen window as they stopped at the intersection that led to his farm. Through binoculars, a concession to practicality that he'd never quite abandoned, he counted 12 men, all armed, all moving with the disciplined coordination of a military unit. Carlos had kept his word about returning with reinforcements, but these weren't the same street thugs from yesterday's confrontation. These men carried themselves like soldiers, their weapons were military grade, and their tactical formation suggested professional training. Rodriguez had been busy overnight, Elias realized. The former soldier had recognized the threat level and upgraded accordingly. His landline telephone rang, an Amish concession to emergency communications. Samuel's voice was tense but controlled. "They're here, Elias. Multiple vehicles, armed men, positioning around the settlement. I see them. Are the families secured?" "Everyone's in the community shelter beneath the church, just as we discussed." The community shelter had been built during the Cold War, when even peaceful farmers had acknowledged the possibility of outside threats. Ironically, it might now serve the purpose its builders had intended. Good. Stay with them, Samuel. Whatever happens out here, keep those children safe. What about you? Elias checked the tactical knife on his belt, then reached into the kitchen cabinet where he'd hidden the second blade retrieved from his barn. Both weapons felt natural in his hands, as familiar as farming tools after 20 years away. "I'm going to do what I should have done in Afghanistan," he said quietly. "I'm going to choose tactical necessity over compassion." He hung up before Samuel could respond. Moving to his bedroom, Elias opened the dresser drawer and took out Maria Santos's letter one final time. The paper was yellowed with age, but her words remained clear. Miguel believed that good men sometimes have to do terrible things to protect innocent people. He would be proud to know that you survived to continue that fight. For the first time in 20 years, Elias allowed himself to believe that she was right. The transformation was subtle but complete. His posture straightened, his movements became more fluid and purposeful. His eyes took on the 1,000-yard stare of a combat veteran. The gentle farmer faded away, replaced by the predator who had once been known as Ghost Shepherd. A knock at his front door interrupted the metamorphosis. Elias glanced through the window and saw Rodriguez standing alone on his porch, hands visible and empty. Behind him, the other cartel soldiers maintained their positions but hadn't advanced. Elias opened the door but remained inside, keeping the tactical advantage of the threshold. "Rodriguez, you remember my name. I remember everything about that. Winter in Kandahar, including the night you carried Corporal Martinez 3 miles through enemy territory with a dislocated shoulder." Rodriguez's face tightened with memory. "He died anyway, bled out 20 minutes before the medevac arrived. But you didn't quit trying to save him. That matters. Does it?" Rodriguez gestured toward the armed men positioned around the property. "Look what I'm doing now." "Everyone makes choices," Elias replied. "You can still make a different one." For a moment, Rodriguez seemed to consider the possibility. Then he shook his head with obvious regret. "Carlos isn't just my boss. He's my cousin. Family, you understand. And he's not going to accept defeat from one old farmer, no matter who that farmer used to be." "Then why are you here?" "Professional courtesy. One soldier to another." Rodriguez met Elias's eyes with genuine respect. Carlos brought military contractors this time. Ex-special forces from Guatemala, 3 tours in narco wars. These aren't street thugs you can intimidate with a knife. How many? 8 contractors. Plus our regular crew, night vision, body armor, automatic weapons, tactical coordination. They're treating this like a military operation. Elias absorbed the information with professional detachment. The odds had shifted significantly, but not impossibly. Superior numbers meant nothing if they could be separated and engaged individually. Why tell me this? Because I've seen enough good soldiers die in stupid wars. You saved lives in Afghanistan, even if you lost some too. That counts for something. Not enough to walk away. Rodriguez glanced back at his waiting colleagues, then returned his attention to Elias. I've got a daughter in Monterrey. School fees, medical bills for my mother. The cartel pays better than the Mexican army ever did. And if you die here, then my family gets death benefits and my daughter finishes school. If I walk away, Carlos kills us all anyway, and my daughter grows up poor. The mathematics of survival in a world where violence was currency. Elias understood it better than most. Rodriguez wasn't evil, just trapped by circumstances that offered no clean choices. 1 hour, Rodriguez said. Carlos wanted to attack at dawn, but I convinced him to give you time to reconsider. After that, you do your job and I do mine. Rodriguez nodded grimly. For what it's worth, I hope you make it through. Take care of yourself, Rodriguez, and try to remember that some orders don't have to be followed. After Rodriguez left, Elias stood in his doorway for a long moment, studying the tactical situation. 8 professional contractors plus 4 cartel soldiers, positioned in a loose perimeter around his 40-acre farm. Standard search and destroy formation, designed to prevent escape and eliminate resistance systematically. But they had made the same mistake Carlos had made yesterday. They assumed they were dealing with an ordinary farmer in an ordinary situation. They had positioned themselves to contain and overwhelm a defensive target, not to hunt a predator who knew every inch of the killing ground. Elias closed the door and walked to his kitchen, where he retrieved a mason jar from beneath the floorboards. Inside were items he'd hoped never to need again: tactical face paint, field communications equipment, and a set of ceramic throwing knives that had served him well in the mountains of Afghanistan. As he applied the camouflage paint with practiced efficiency, Elias whispered a prayer for the souls of the men he was about to kill, and for his own soul, which was about to be stained with blood once again. The hour Rodriguez had bought him would be enough. By the time the storm clouds overhead opened up to release their rain, Ghost Shepherd would be ready to remind the world why some farmers were more dangerous than entire armies. The old radio frequency scanner had been gathering dust in Elias's workshop for 20 years, hidden beneath canvas tarps and farm equipment. He'd kept it more from habit than expectation, a piece of his former life that he couldn't quite bring himself to abandon completely. Now, as he powered up the device with hands that remembered every frequency and protocol, it felt like greeting an old friend. The scanner crackled to life, immediately picking up the tactical communications of the men surrounding his property. They were using military-grade encrypted radios, but Elias recognized the encryption standard, an older system that he'd worked with extensively during his operational years. Perimeter teams in position, came the first transmission. Target remains inside primary structure. Copy that, Falcon 1. Raven team has visual on secondary buildings, no movement detected. Professional terminology, disciplined communication protocols, coordinated positioning. Rodriguez hadn't exaggerated about the quality of reinforcements Carlos had brought. Elias adjusted the frequency, scanning for additional channels. What he found made him pause. A separate network operating on federal law enforcement frequencies. This is Sheriff Santos, requesting immediate backup at the Amish settlement on County Road 47. We have reports of armed militants surrounding civilian families. Maria Santos, No relation to the sergeant who had died in his arms, but a good woman trying to protect her community with resources that were woefully inadequate for the situation developing around them. "Backup is 40 minutes out," came the dispatcher's response. "Can you maintain distance until additional units arrive?" "Negative. I've got civilian families at risk, moving to establish contact with the suspected militants." Elias swore softly, in Pennsylvania Dutch, a habit he'd picked up from Samuel Byler during moments of frustration. Sheriff Santos was driving into a killing field, and her 2 deputies wouldn't survive contact with professional contractors. He switched back to the cartel frequency and time to hear orders being issued. "Sheriff approaching from the east. 2 vehicles, minimal escort. Take them alive for questioning, then eliminate." The tactical situation had just become infinitely more complex. Elias could handle 12 cartel soldiers operating on his prepared terrain, but protecting law enforcement. Officers who didn't know they were walking into an ambush changed everything. His secure satellite phone, another relic of his operational days that he'd maintained through off-the-books channels, had been hidden in a waterproof container beneath his workshop floor. The device looked ancient compared to modern smartphones, but it connected to communication networks that officially didn't exist. The number he dialed belonged to a man known only as Control, his former handler in Special Operations Command, who had managed ghost teams across 3 theaters of war. If Control was still alive, still in position, still willing to acknowledge the existence of operatives who had never officially existed, he might be able to coordinate assets that could level the playing field. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Secure line, identify yourself." Ghost Shepherd, requesting immediate tactical support. A pause, followed by the sound of computer keys clicking rapidly. "Ghost Shepherd went dark 20 years ago. This line is reserved for active operations only." "Control, this is Elias Reeves, former team leader for Operational Task Group 7. I need help, and I need it now." Another pause, longer this time. "Jesus Christ, Shepherd! We thought you were dead. Where the hell have you been for 2 decades?" "Texas, farming, living clean." Elias watched through his window as Sheriff Santos's cruiser appeared in the distance, approaching the tactical kill zone that the contractors had established. "But I've got cartel soldiers threatening American families, and local law enforcement is about to walk into an ambush." "What's your tactical assessment?" Despite 20 years away from military operations, Elias found the old protocols returning. With startling clarity, 12 hostiles, mixed skill levels. 8 appeared to be professional contractors, probably Guatemalan special forces turned private security. 4 are local cartel muscle. They've established a perimeter around a civilian settlement, 17 families, approximately 40 individuals including children. Your assets? Single operator, familiar terrain, extensive preparation time. Shepherd, you're 20 years out of practice and outnumbered 12 to 1. Request immediate extraction to safe zone for debriefing. Through the scanner, Elias heard the cartel coordinator issuing final orders. Sheriff's vehicle in kill zone in 90 seconds. Initiate contact. Negative on extraction control. I have civilians to protect and insufficient time for backup arrival. Requesting tactical support assets if available. More key clicking, followed by a longer silence. There's a Predator drone, conducting routine border surveillance approximately 15 miles from your position. Flight designation Watchdog 37. I can redirect for intelligence gathering, but direct support would require authorization that I don't currently possess. Intelligence gathering is sufficient. I need real-time positioning data on hostile forces. Understood. Watchdog 37 will be on station in 12 minutes. Anything else? Elias considered the tactical situation, calculating odds and variables. With the cold precision that had made him legendary in special operations circles. If this goes badly, Control, There are innocent families in a shelter beneath the community church. They're not combatants. Whatever happens to me, make sure someone gets them out safely. Copy that, Shepard. For what it's worth, your psychological profile indicated you'd found peace. Why are you doing this? Elias looked across his property, at the land he'd worked for 20 years, the community that had given him a second chance at humanity, the children who had taught him that some things were worth any sacrifice. Because some peace has to be fought for, he said quietly. The line went dead. Sheriff Santos's cruiser was now visible on the main road, approaching the intersection where the contractors had positioned their primary ambush team. Elias had perhaps 3 minutes to prevent law enforcement casualties that would escalate this situation beyond any hope of containment. He gathered his weapons, both tactical knives, the ceramic throwing blades, and a compound bow that he'd ostensibly used for hunting, but which had been selected for its stopping power and silence. The face paint was already applied, his movements were fluid and purposeful, and his mind had shifted into the tactical mode that had once made him one of the most feared operatives in the military. But as he prepared to leave his house, possibly for the last time, Elias paused at his bedroom dresser. Beneath the carefully folded plain clothes and the letter from Sergeant Santos's widow lay one final item, a small wooden cross, crudely carved, but representing 20 years of attempted redemption. He picked up the cross and held it for a moment, feeling its weight, not just the physical weight of carved wood, but the spiritual weight of promises made and principles embraced. Then he slipped it into his shirt pocket, directly over his heart. If he was going to war again, he would carry with him both the man he'd been and the man he'd tried to become. Perhaps somewhere between Ghost Shepherd and Elias Zimmerman, he could find a way to protect the innocent without losing his soul entirely. The radio crackled with updates as he moved toward his back door. Sheriff's vehicle now in primary kill zone. All units report ready. Weapons hot, prepare for contact. Time had run out for peaceful solutions. Ghost Shepherd had work to do. The encrypted satellite phone vibrated against Elias's chest as he moved through the drainage ditch that ran along his southern property line. He'd covered 200 yards in complete silence, positioning himself between Sheriff Santos's approaching vehicle and the ambush team that waited in the tree line. He answered on the first vibration, speaking in barely audible whispers. Ghost Shepherd. Change of plans, Shepherd. Control's voice carried an edge of urgency that sent adrenaline surging through Elias's system. I've got updates that completely alter your tactical situation. Sheriff's in the kill zone in 60 seconds. Whatever you've got, make it fast. The cartel operation you're facing isn't random. Carlos Mendoza is a frontman for Los Hermanos del Diablo, the most sophisticated drug trafficking organization in the Western Hemisphere. But that's not the important part. Elias continued moving through the ditch, his trained eyes cataloging the positions of 3 contractors who had positioned themselves to interdict Sheriff Santos's vehicle. What's the important part? Los Hermanos has been compromised by a joint DEA-CIA operation called Broken Mirror. The entire cartel leadership structure is under federal surveillance, including real-time monitoring of their tactical communications. That stopped Elias cold. If federal agents were monitoring cartel communications, they knew about the threat to the Amish settlement. They knew about the professional contractors. They knew innocent families were at risk. Why hasn't federal law enforcement intervened? Because Broken Mirror is a long-term operation designed to map the entire organizational structure before taking action. Premature intervention could compromise years of intelligence gathering. The implications hit Elias like a physical blow. The federal government was willing to sacrifice civilian lives to protect an ongoing operation. How long have you known about this? Your call triggered automatic alerts in multiple agencies. I've spent the last 10 minutes getting briefed on an operation that I wasn't read into until you forced the issue. Through his binoculars, Elias could see Sheriff Santos's cruiser approaching the intersection. Behind her, a second vehicle carrying her two deputies maintained close formation. "Control, I need you to be very clear about something. Are you ordering me to stand down and allow civilian casualties to protect a federal operation?" The silence stretched for nearly 10 seconds, an eternity in tactical time. "No official orders can be issued to an operative who doesn't officially exist," Control said finally. "But I'm telling you that intervention on your part could compromise national security interests. And I'm telling you that there are children in that settlement, including an 8-year-old girl named Rebecca Stoltzfus, who makes wooden dolls for her friends and helps her mother hang laundry every Tuesday morning." "Shepard, are you monitoring this conversation, Control?" "Of course. Then make sure whoever's listening understands this. Ghost Shepard is officially returning to active duty, effective immediately. My mission parameters are protection of American civilians from hostile forces, regardless of political considerations." Elias ended the call and switched off the phone. The truth settled over him like a familiar weight. He'd never actually retired from military service. His 20-year stay in the Amish community hadn't been exile or redemption. It had been deep cover, so deep that even he'd forgotten it was a mission. The psychological profile, the careful placement in a community that would accept him without questions, the maintained communication equipment, the retained operational skills, all of it had been part of an elaborate long-term infiltration designed to establish assets along smuggling corridors. But somewhere during those 20 years of farming and community service, the cover identity had become real. Elias Zimmerman wasn't a fictional construct anymore. He was a genuine identity that coexisted with Ghost Shepard, each as authentic as the other. The radio in his ear crackled with contractor communications. "Local law enforcement. Entering kill zone. Confirm engagement authorization. Authorized. Take them alive for interrogation, then eliminate." Elias reached the position he'd selected, a concrete culvert that offered cover and multiple escape routes. Sheriff Santos's cruiser was now less than 100 yards from the ambush point. His satellite phone vibrated again. Against his better judgment, he answered. "This is Deputy Director Harrison, DEA Operations Division," came a voice he didn't recognize. "You are ordered to stand down immediately and avoid compromising Operation Broken Mirror." "Deputy Director Harrison," Elias replied calmly. "This is Master Sergeant Elias Reeves, Special Operations Task Group 7. I am currently engaged in protection of American civilians from hostile action. Federal agencies choosing not to intervene do not have authority to prevent military personnel from executing lawful orders." "You haven't been active military for 20 years. Check your files again, sir. Deep cover operatives remain on active status for the duration of their assignments. I was never officially discharged." The legal technicality was probably meaningless, but it would buy him time and provide political cover for Control if the situation escalated to congressional oversight. If you engage those contractors, you'll be starting a war that could destabilize the entire border region. Sheriff Santos's vehicle was 50 yards from the kill zone. Elias could see the lead contractor's weapon trained on her windshield. Then, maybe you should have thought of that before you decided civilian lives were acceptable losses for your intelligence operation. He ended the call and drew his first throwing knife. The contractor in the tree line never saw the blade that took him down, a perfect shot that severed his spinal cord at the base of his skull. His weapon clattered to the ground as his body went limp. "Falcon 1 is down," came the panicked radio transmission. "Contact! Contact! We have an unknown sniper." Elias was already moving, using the confusion to relocate before return fire could be directed at his position. The second contractor was scanning the tree line with night vision goggles, searching for a threat that was attacking from ground level. The ceramic knife took him in the throat. "Falcon 2 down. Where the fuck is the shooter?" Sheriff Santos's cruiser squealed to a halt as she recognized the sound of weapons fire. Her training kicked in and she reversed course, trying to get her deputies out of the kill zone. But the remaining contractors had adapted quickly to the new threat. Instead of maintaining their ambush positions, they were now coordinating a search-and-destroy sweep designed to locate and eliminate Elias. Unknown hostile is using bladed weapons, highly mobile, extensive knowledge of local terrain, came the professional assessment over the radio. Recommend we execute primary mission and extract before more law enforcement arrives. The primary mission, attacking the settlement itself. Elias's blood went cold. By eliminating the ambush team, he'd forced the contractors to accelerate their timeline. Instead of questioning Sheriff Santos about law enforcement response plans, they would now move directly against the families sheltering beneath the church. His satellite phone rang again. "Shepard, this is Control. Watchdog 37 is now on station and providing real-time intelligence. I'm seeing thermal signatures of multiple hostiles moving toward the civilian shelter. How long until they reach the church?" 8 minutes. At current movement speed. Elias looked across the open ground that separated him from the settlement. 8 minutes to cover nearly a mile of terrain while being hunted by professional soldiers who now knew they were dealing with a highly skilled opponent. "Control, I need you to do something for me." "What?" "Contact Samuel Beeler at the community shelter. Tell him Ghost Shepherd is coming home and that he should prepare the families for immediate evacuation through the old mine shaft. There's a mine shaft built during the Depression, connects the church basement to a natural cave system about half a mile east. The Amish have been using it for storm shelter for 70 years. How do you know about it?" Elias was already sprinting. Across open ground, no longer concerned with concealment. Speed was more important than stealth now. "Because I've been doing reconnaissance on this settlement for 20 years, Control, just like you trained me to." The truth was both liberating and terrifying. He'd never stopped being a soldier, never stopped being operational, never stopped preparing for the day when his two identities would have to merge. Ghost Shepherd and Elias Zimmerman were about to become the same person, and God help anyone who stood between them and the innocent families they'd sworn to protect. The hand-forged horseshoe hung above the door of Elias's workshop, exactly where he'd placed it during his first year on the farm. He'd made it himself, learning the ancient craft from Samuel Byler's eldest son, Jacob, who had taught him that. Metalwork was both art and prayer, shaping raw materials into something useful and beautiful through patience and skill. Now, as he sprinted past the workshop toward the settlement, that horseshoe represented everything he stood to lose. Not just the peaceful life he'd built, but the transformation he'd undergone from instrument of death to creator of simple, honest things. His earpiece crackled with updates from Control. Watchdog 37 shows 8 thermal signatures converging. On the church from multiple vectors. ETA to target structure is 6 minutes 40 seconds, 6 minutes to cover 800 yards while being hunted by professional killers, 6 minutes to reach families who trusted him to protect them, 6 minutes to prove that 20 years of peace hadn't made him soft. The drainage ditches that crisscrossed the settlement had been designed for irrigation, but Elias had always seen them for what they could become: concealed approach routes that would allow rapid movement without silhouetting against the horizon. He dropped into the main channel and began moving with fluid efficiency, his body remembering the rhythm of tactical movement even after 2 decades away from war. "Ghost Shepherd, this is Control. Be advised, federal assets are en route to your location, but won't arrive for another 22 minutes. You're on your own until then." "Understood. What's the status on civilian evacuation?" Samuel Byler confirms families are moving into the mineshaft system, but he reports that 3 elderly community members refuse to leave. They're barricaded in the church sanctuary, praying. Elias swore softly. Elder Daniel Yoder, Martha Stoltzfus, and probably old Heinrich Müller. 3 people who had lived through the Depression, World War II, and the Korean conflict. and who would rather die in their place of worship than abandon it to armed invaders. Can Samuel convince them to evacuate? Negative. He says they've made their peace with God and won't be moved. The tactical situation had just become impossibly complex. Elias couldn't allow innocent people to be executed, but protecting them would require him to engage 8 professional contractors in close-quarters combat within a structure that offered limited defensive advantages. He reached the intersection of 2 drainage channels and paused to assess his options. To his left, the main channel continued directly toward the church. Fast approach, but it would put him in the middle of the contractor's converging attack pattern. To his right, a secondary channel curved around to approach the church from the east, adding precious time but offering better tactical positioning. The choice was made for him when his earpiece transmitted panicked Spanish. "Contact rear! We've got movement in the eastern drainage system." They'd spotted his thermal signature. "All units converge on grid 77. Unknown hostile attempting to flank our primary advance." Elias smiled grimly. The contractors were making the classic mistake of assuming their enemy would behave predictably. Instead of continuing toward the church, he reversed course and headed directly toward their abandoned overwatch position. "Control, I need real-time positioning on all hostile contacts." "Copy that. Uploading tactical display to your earpiece now." The small screen in his tactical communicator lit up with a bird's-eye view of the settlement, thermal signatures marking the location of each contractor. They were repositioning to intercept him in the drainage system, leaving their eastern approach route temporarily undefended. Watchdog 37 indicates hostiles are moving away from primary target to engage you directly, Control reported. This could be your chance to reach the church before they reorganize. But Elias was no longer thinking about reaching the church. He was thinking about eliminating the threat entirely. The contractor's abandoned equipment cache was exactly where he'd calculated it would be, a tactical staging area with spare ammunition, communication equipment, and backup weapons. More importantly, it contained something he needed, a case of military-grade explosive charges designed for breaching doors and walls. "Ghost Shepherd, what's your status?" "Acquiring additional assets," Elias replied, carefully examining the explosive devices. The technology had advanced since his operational days, but the principles remained the same. "Control, I need you to relay a message to Samuel Byler, standing by. Tell him that in approximately 4 minutes, there will be multiple explosions. Throughout the settlement, the families should remain in the mine shaft until I give the all-clear signal. 3 long blasts on the church bell." "Understood. What's your tactical plan?" Elias attached the shaped charges to his equipment harness and began moving toward predetermined positions throughout the settlement. Each charge would be placed at a structural weak point he'd identified during 20 years of maintenance work. Spots where a small explosion would create maximum disruption, while minimizing collateral damage to buildings that could be repaired. "I'm going to remind these contractors why special operations soldiers don't retire. They just get more creative." The first charge went beneath the water tower that supplied the settlement's irrigation system. When detonated, it would flood the main road and create impassable mud barriers that would prevent vehicle escape. The second charge was positioned at the electrical junction box that controlled the settlement's emergency lighting system. The contractors were using night vision equipment, which meant sudden illumination would blind them temporarily. The third and fourth charges went into the root cellars of 2 abandoned farmhouses. When triggered, they would create the impression of a much larger defensive force engaging from multiple positions. "Control, are the contractors still moving toward my last known position?" "Affirmative. They've divided into 2 4-man teams, attempting to bracket your location in the drainage system." "Perfect." Elias was no longer in the drainage system. He'd climbed out near the old schoolhouse and was now positioned on the roof of Samuel Byler's barn, with clear sightlines across the entire settlement. The compound bow in his hands had been designed for hunting deer, but the broadhead arrows he'd selected were designed for penetrating body armor. Watchdog 3-7 shows all hostile contacts converging on empty drainage channels. Control reported with what sounded like admiration. They're about to realize they've been outmaneuvered. Elias drew back his first arrow and sighted on the lead contractor in the eastern drainage channel. The man was moving with professional caution, weapon ready, eyes scanning for threats. He would never see the arrow that killed him. The shot was perfect, a clean hit that dropped the target instantly without alerting his teammates. "Falcon 4 is down," came the panicked transmission. "Sniper contact from elevated position." But Elias was already moving, using the barn's multiple levels to change position before return fire could be directed at him. The second arrow took down another contractor before they could locate the source of the attack. 2 hostiles down, unknown location, request immediate extract. "Negative on extract," came the response from Carlos, who was monitoring from his command vehicle. "Complete the mission or don't come back." The remaining 6 contractors were now caught in the open, their night vision equipment useless against an enemy who was striking from unexpected angles and positions. They began moving toward the church in desperation, hoping to complete their primary objective before Elias could eliminate them all. That's when he triggered the explosive charges. The water tower explosion sent thousands of gallons cascading across the main road, creating instant swampland that bogged down the contractors' vehicles. The electrical junction explosion flooded the settlement with emergency lighting, overwhelming the contractors' night vision systems. The root cellar explosions created the illusion of coordinated defensive fire from multiple positions. In the chaos that followed, Elias moved through the settlement like a ghost, picking off confused and disoriented targets with arrows, knives, and in one case, a sharpened farming implement that he drove through a contractor's chest with surgical precision. Control, 6 hostiles down, 2 remaining. They're heading for the church. Copy that. Be advised, Sheriff Santos has called for federal backup. Multiple agencies responding, ETA 12 minutes. 12 minutes might as well be 12 hours. The remaining contractors had reached the church and were preparing to breach the doors where 3 elderly Amish people knelt in prayer, refusing to abandon their faith or their sanctuary. Elias reached the church as the contractors were setting up their breaching charges. Through the stained glass windows, he could see Elder Daniel Yoda's frail form kneeling at the altar, Martha Stoltzfus beside him, clutching her well-worn Bible, and Heinrich Müller standing with his hand on Yoda's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity and comfort. The sight of those 3 people who had accepted him, taught him, loved him, facing death with quiet dignity, ignited something primal in Elias's chest. Not the cold, tactical fury of Ghost Shepherd, but the protective rage of a man defending his family. He drew both tactical knives and approached the church doors from behind the contractors. They were so focused on their breaching charges that they never sensed the predator stalking them. "Control," he whispered into his earpiece. "Tell Samuel that Ghost Shepherd is coming home." The final phase of the battle was about to begin, and Elias Zimmerman, farmer, craftsman, and protector of innocence, would stand with Ghost Shepherd to defend everything they both held sacred. The blessed ammunition had been Samuel Byler's idea, though he'd never spoken of it openly. During the long night while Elias prepared for battle, the elderly Amish elder had quietly approached each family patriarch and asked a question that challenged everything they believed about pacifism and protection. "If violence must come to our valley," Samuel had asked, "should it be godless violence or violence sanctified by prayer and righteous purpose?" The ceramic arrows in Elias's quiver had been touched by every elder's hand, blessed with whispered prayers for protection of the innocent and swift justice for those who would harm children. It was a contradiction that would have troubled their consciences in peaceful times, but these were not peaceful times. Elder Daniel Yoda's voice carried through the church walls, strong despite his 80 years. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. The contractor at the church door cursed as he struggled with the breaching charge. These doors are solid oak, reinforced with iron bands. It's going to take a bigger charge than we brought. Then, use what we have and finish this, his partner replied, checking his watch nervously. Carlos wants confirmation of target elimination in the next 5 minutes. Elias positioned himself 15 yards behind them, using the church's stone foundation for concealment. Both contractors were professionals. Their stance, their communication, patterns, their weapon handling all indicated extensive training and experience. Under normal circumstances, they would have detected his approach long before he could close to effective range. But these weren't normal circumstances. The settlement's emergency lights had destroyed their night vision adaptation. The multiple explosions had left them disoriented and jumping at shadows, and they were operating under time pressure that made them careless. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. Elder Yoda's voice continued the psalm with perfect calm, as if armed killers weren't preparing to breach his sanctuary. Behind him, Martha Stoltzfus had begun humming a hymn in Pennsylvania Dutch, while Heinrich Müller maintained his protective stance with the dignity of a man who had survived the Great Depression and 2 wars. The first contractor looked up from his explosive charge just in time to see death approaching in the form of a blessed arrow. Elias's shot was perfect. The broadhead took the man in the center of his chest, penetrating body armor and stopping his heart instantly. His partner spun toward the source of the attack, automatic weapon coming up with professional speed. But Elias was already moving, using the church's architectural features for cover and concealment. The contractor's muzzle flash lit up the night as he fired, burst after burst at shadows and movement that stayed 1 step ahead of his aim. Base, this is Falcon 7. We are under attack at the primary target. Unknown sniper has eliminated my partner. Request immediate backup. Negative, Falcon 7. No backup available. Complete your mission or abort. But Carlos's voice over the radio carried an edge of desperation that suggested his command position was no longer secure. Sheriff Santos had called for federal backup, and someone was taking a very close interest in the cartel operation that had been under surveillance for months. Elias circled around to the contractor's blind side, moving with the fluid silence that had made him legendary in special operations. The second blessed arrow took the man in the throat, ending his desperate radio transmissions and his life simultaneously. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. The psalm continued from within the church, uninterrupted by the violence that had swirled around the sacred space. Elias approached the heavy oak doors and knocked gently, the same pattern he'd used for 20 years when visiting Samuel Byler. Elder Yoda, it's Elias. The danger has passed. The door opened to reveal 3 faces that showed no surprise at his tactical gear, his weapons, or the blood on his hands. Daniel Yoda looked at him with eyes that held complete understanding. We knew who you were, son, the old man said gently. Samuel told us years ago. We've been praying for this day, praying it would never come, but also praying that if it did, you would be ready. Martha Stoltzfus stepped forward and touched his cheek with a weathered hand. You saved our children, Elias. You saved our families. God forgive us all for the blood that was necessary, but you saved our children. Heinrich Müller nodded gravely. The settlement is secure. Yes, sir. All threats have been eliminated, but federal agents are en route, and there will be questions that we will answer honestly. Elder Yoda interrupted. We are Amish, but we are not fools. We know the difference between aggression and protection, between murder and righteous defense of the innocent. Through the church windows, Elias could see lights approaching in the distance, multiple vehicles moving fast. Sheriff Santos was bringing backup, and probably federal agents who would want extensive debriefings about what had happened in this quiet valley. But for this moment, standing in the doorway of the church where he'd worshipped for 20 years, surrounded by people who had accepted both his peaceful and his violent sides. Elias felt something he hadn't experienced since Afghanistan: completeness. Ghost Shepherd and Elias Zimmerman were no longer at war with each other. They were finally truly the same person. Carlos Mendoza's gold crucifix caught the emergency lights as he stepped out of his command vehicle, automatic weapon in hand. The religious symbol hung heavy around his neck, a twisted interpretation of faith that somehow justified the murder of innocents in the name of profit and power. "Rodriguez!" he barked into his radio. "Where the hell are my men?" Static answered him. His professional contractors were dead, his tactical advantage had evaporated, and now federal law enforcement vehicles were visible on the horizon. There, emergency lights painting the night sky in red and blue. But Carlos wasn't a man who accepted defeat easily. If his operation was blown, if his men were dead, if the settlement had somehow fought back successfully, then he would salvage what he could from the disaster, starting with the elimination of whoever had destroyed his carefully planned assault. "Base to any Falcon units, report status immediately." Silence. Elias watched from the church steps as Carlos moved through the settlement, searching for survivors among his scattered forces. The cartel leader's movements were increasingly desperate, his radio calls growing more frantic as the reality of his situation became clear. "Control, this is Ghost Shepherd. Primary threats have been eliminated, but the command element is still active and armed." "Copy that, Shepherd. Federal assets are 3 minutes out. Can you maintain visual on the hostile commander until backup arrives?" Through his tactical scope, Elias studied Carlos's movements. The man was systematic, despite his growing panic, checking each position where his men had been stationed, trying to understand how his superior force had been systematically destroyed by what he'd assumed was a single opponent. "Control, be advised that the hostile commander is wearing religious symbols and appears to be operating under the delusion that his criminal activities are somehow sanctified. Psychological profile suggests he may attempt a final confrontation, rather than strategic withdrawal." Understood. Rules of engagement? Elias considered the question while watching Carlos approach the area where 2 of his contractors lay dead near the drainage system. 20 years of Amish teaching had emphasized forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility that even the worst sinners could find their way to salvation. But 20 years of military experience had taught him that some men were simply beyond redemption, and that showing mercy to the irredeemable often resulted in more innocent deaths. "Self-defense protocols. I will attempt to apprehend, but I will not allow him to escape or threaten civilian populations." Carlos had found Rodriguez's body near the eastern perimeter and was kneeling beside his fallen cousin. Grief and rage warring in his expression. The gold crucifix swayed as he stood, and when he turned toward the church, his face showed the cold fury of a man who had decided that if he couldn't win, he would at least extract revenge. "This is Deputy Director Harrison, DEA Operations," came a new voice over Elias's earpiece. "You are ordered to avoid engagement with the hostile commander. Carlos Mendoza is a high-value intelligence asset whose capture could provide crucial information about cartel operations throughout the region." Elias almost laughed. Even now, with bodies scattered throughout the settlement and innocent families hiding in mine shafts, federal bureaucrats were worried about protecting their intelligence assets. "Deputy Director Harrison, this is Master Sergeant Elias Reeves. Carlos Mendoza just drew a sidearm and is approaching the church where 3 elderly civilians are located. Your intelligence asset is about to become a casualty statistic. I'm ordered to protect American civilians from hostile action." Elias interrupted. "That's exactly what I'm going to do." Carlos had reached the church and was shouting in Spanish, his voice carrying across the settlement. "Come out, Phantom! Come out and face me like a man! You've killed my family, destroyed my operation. Now let's finish this." Elder Yoda appeared in the church doorway, his ancient frame silhouetted against the soft glow of oil lamps within. "Son!" he called out. In English, his voice carrying the authority of 8 decades. "You don't want to do this. There's been enough killing tonight. Get back inside, old man, or I'll kill you where you stand." Carlos raised his weapon toward Elder Yoda, and Elias's decision was made for him. Some lines could not be crossed. Some threats could not be tolerated. Some evil could not be reasoned with or redeemed. The blessed arrow took Carlos center mass, but the man was wearing body armor, and the shot wasn't immediately fatal. He staggered backward, looked down at the arrow protruding from his chest, then raised his eyes toward the church bell tower where Elias had positioned himself for the final confrontation. "There you are," Carlos said, blood beginning to foam at his lips. "Ghost Shepherd." He raised his weapon toward Elias with the last of his strength, but his hands were shaking and his vision was blurring. The shots went wide, striking stone and timber but harming no one. Elias descended from the bell tower with deliberate slowness. Another arrow nocked and ready. Carlos had fallen to his knees, but was still trying to aim his weapon, the gold crucifix now stained with his blood. "It's over," Elias said quietly. "Your men are dead. Your operation is blown, and federal agents will be here in 60 seconds. Drop your weapon." Carlos looked at the approaching figure, part Amish farmer, part special operations soldier, entirely committed to protecting the innocent, and finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Who are you really?" he gasped. Elias stopped, 5 feet away, arrow still drawn. "I'm a man who learned that some peace has to be fought for." Carlos's weapon clattered to the ground as his strength failed. The gold crucifix fell forward, no longer a symbol of twisted faith, but simply metal, around the neck of a dying man who had chosen violence and found himself outmatched by someone who had chosen to protect others. 6 months later, Elias stood in his workshop carving a replacement for the wooden cross that had been destroyed during the federal investigation that followed the Cartel attack. The new cross was different from the original, still simple, still handmade, but incorporating scars from the battle that had transformed both him and his community. The wood was cedar, salvaged from a tree that had been damaged by stray gunfire during the firefight. Instead of trying to hide the bullet holes and gouges, Elias had incorporated them into the design, letting the scars become part of the cross's character. It was a fitting metaphor for his own transformation. He could never again be the purely peaceful man he'd tried to become, but he could be a whole man who understood that sometimes love demanded violence to protect the innocent. The morning. Sun streamed through his workshop windows, illuminating wood shavings and tools that were familiar friends after 20 years of use. But now there were additions to his workspace. Tactical equipment that he maintained alongside his farming implements, communication devices that connected him to networks he'd thought he'd left behind forever. Control had been right about one. "A thing," he reflected as he worked the cedar with patient strokes of his knife. The man who had fought in the settlement was not the same man who had farmed there peacefully for 20 years, but he wasn't Ghost Shepherd either. He was someone entirely new, someone who could carry both identities without contradiction. Samuel Byler appeared in the workshop doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of a man who had come to terms with complexity. "How's the new cross coming along?" "Slowly," Elias replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I want to get it right this time." The first one was right too, for its time and purpose. They stood in comfortable silence, 2 men who had both been changed by the events of that night. Samuel had struggled with the moral implications of blessing ammunition and supporting violence, even in defense of innocent lives. But the sight of Rebecca Stoltzfus playing safely in her yard, of children who might have been killed if not for Elias's intervention, had resolved his theological crisis. "Any word from Control about the new arrangements?" Samuel asked. "Official word comes through tomorrow, but the informal message is positive. The government wants to maintain an asset in this region, and I want to stay where I've built a life, It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. The new arrangement was elegant in its simplicity. Elias would continue farming, continue participating in the Amish community, continue living the peaceful life he'd built over 2 decades. But he would also maintain his connection to federal law enforcement, serving as an early warning system for cartel activity along the border, and as a rapid response asset when diplomatic solutions proved insufficient. "The elders have voted," Samuel said. "Unanimously." Elias paused in his carving, waiting. "You remain a full member of our community, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. Your actions during the attack are considered righteous defense of the innocent, consistent with our deepest values, even if they required methods we don't normally embrace." The relief that washed over Elias was profound. He'd been prepared to accept excommunication as the price of protecting his neighbors, but the community's acceptance of his dual nature meant more than any government recognition could. What about the families? How are they adjusting? Better than expected. The children see you as a hero, which makes Rebecca's parents nervous but also grateful. The adults understand that sometimes God works through imperfect instruments to accomplish his purposes. Through the workshop window, Elias could see the settlement returning to normal rhythms. Crops were being harvested, animals tended, furniture grafted. The physical damage from the battle had been repaired within weeks, but the psychological impact had taken longer to heal. Elder Yoda had surprised everyone by requesting that Elias teach basic self-defense techniques to the young men of the community. "We remain committed to peace," the old man had explained, "but peace without the ability to defend it is merely helplessness disguised as virtue." Sheriff Santos had become a regular visitor to the settlement, working with Elias to establish communication protocols and emergency response procedures. The federal investigation had cleared all community members of any wrongdoing, and the intelligence gathered from the cartel's equipment had led to dozens of arrests throughout the region. "There's something else," Samuel said, reaching into his coat pocket. "This came for you through official channels." The envelope bore the seal of the Department of Defense. Inside was a letter of commendation for extraordinary service in defense of civilian lives, along with notification that Master Sergeant Elias Reeves had been posthumously awarded the Silver Star for actions during his final mission in Afghanistan. Posthumously? Elias raised an eyebrow. Elias Reeves officially died in a training accident 20 years ago. Elias Zimmerman has no military record to speak of. It's a bureaucratic courtesy that allows both identities to coexist without creating legal complications. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 20 years trying to bury Ghost Shepherd, only to discover that both identities could survive and even complement each other when properly integrated. "Samuel, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "That night when Carlos threatened the settlement, if I had chosen differently, if I had maintained pure pacifism and allowed those families to be harmed, would you have forgiven me?" Samuel considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he said finally, "but I would also have spent the rest of my life wondering if we had misunderstood God's will. Sometimes the most Christ-like action is to take upon yourself the burden of violence so that others can remain pure." Elias returned to his carving, each stroke of the knife revealing more of the cross hidden within the scarred cedar. When it was finished, it would hang in his bedroom as a reminder that redemption wasn't a destination, but a journey, one that could incorporate all aspects of a person's experience, even the darkest chapters. The settlement had found a new kind of peace, one that acknowledged the existence of evil while remaining committed to goodness. And Elias Zimmerman, farmer, protector, and servant of both God and country, had finally found a way to be completely himself in a world that demanded both gentleness and strength. Outside, children played in safety, families worked in security, and somewhere in the distance, federal agents maintained watch over a border that had become a little safer, because one man had refused to choose between his identities and had instead found a way to honor them both.